Jesus said to the Father that glorify me with the glory that I had with you before the world began. So the
Yes.
Christian will say that, look, Jesus had glory with the Father before the world began, so Jesus pre-existed, thus Jesus is God. It's along them lines that the Christian is trying to use the case. Now bear in mind that that doesn't actually answer the question as to why Jesus called the Father the only true God 2 verses earlier. But anyway, there's a few ways to respond to John chapter 17, verse number 5. The first one is, it doesn't mean that Jesus literally pre-existed before the earth began. Jews had a way of, when it came to God's decrees, they spoke of it as already existing before the world began. Like, just say someone wants to ask God to go to heaven, and he says to God, please, God, give me the reward that you gave, that I had with you before the world began. What the Jew means is what was decreed for me before the world began. It doesn't mean that he literally had it. He literally was there before the world began. And to further cement this point, if you go to Raymond Bryan's 2-volume commentary on the Gospel of John, Raymond Bryan even mentions that there's a variant in the manuscripts. There's another variant where Jesus says that may you glorify me with the glory that was with you before the world began. According to the variant, it wasn't Jesus that had it with, didn't have the glory with God before the world began. It's that the glory existed before the world began. That's a variant reading. And also, Augustine, he didn't believe that this verse was a proof text for the deity of Jesus. He understood it the way I've just mentioned it now. Pretty sure off the top of my head, it was either Augustine or John Calvin who understood it the way I've just said it, that it meant that the glory that was decreed before the world began. So that doesn't prove Jesus' deity at all. On top of that, to further solidify this point, that it doesn't prove Jesus' deity, okay, let's just say, okay, Jesus existed with God before the world began. He had the glory before the world began. How does that make him God? That only means he pre-existed. He could have been an angel. He could have been a million things. That don't automatically mean he's God. Because if it does, then you're in for a bigger problem. For example, the book of Hebrews chapter 7 verse number 3 talks about Melchizedek, who had no father, no mother, no genealogy, no beginning, no end. So if pre-existing before the world began makes you God, then they need to add the fourth member to the Trinity as well.
Wow, so the idea of acknowledging the fact that Jesus pre-existed in no way can compromise the unity of God, but rather, what you explained to us just now, it just means that Jesus had an existence with God as a servant, but not as God himself.
Definitely, when Jesus was saying to God, according to this verse, if you take it back into his Semitic culture, into the Israelite culture, when he said to God, glorify me with the glory that I had with you before the world began. In other words, he's saying to God, give me that glory that you decreed for me before the world began. That doesn't contradict Islam. We believe that Allah decreed many things before he created the world, etc. So that doesn't contradict us at all. On top of that, this actually refutes that Jesus is God. I'll tell you how. In Isaiah chapter 42 and in other parts of Isaiah, the God of the Old Testament says, I share my glory with no one else. I'm pretty sure you've come across the passages. Whereas in John chapter 17, further down the chapter, Jesus shares the glory with his disciples. So the God of the Old Testament says, I do not share my glory with nobody, but yet Jesus shared his glory with his disciples, which means he can't be the God of the Old Testament unless he changed his personality. He decided later that I need to share my glory. I said I don't share my glory, but now for some reason I want to share my glory with my disciples, probably including Judas as well.
Is it safe to conclude also from the statement, something very subtle, but I think very has serious theological implications? Jesus is asking God to restore his glory. So the fact that he's asking God, would this be sufficient enough evidence that Jesus cannot be God, since he's asking God to restore something to him? Does God need anyone to give him anything, or does he need to ask someone something that belonged to him before to return it?
Of course, we know that, as Muslims, that this is a silly thought. This is a very silly question. We know this cannot refer to God. But Trinitarians, you see, under the influence of Paul, who is probably to blame for most of this polytheism that is spread throughout the world. Paul, with the Philippians chapter 2, once again, is what Trinitarians appeal to. Jesus humbled himself. He gave up his deity because he needed to save mankind from Adam and Eve eating the apple, etc. So they will say that he humbled himself. That's why he's saying all these things. But then the question comes back again. What about when he was back in his full glory in John chapter 20 after the resurrection, and yet he still says he has a God? And then in Revelations chapter 3, he still says that he has a God. And then in even Paul says, I believe it's in 1 Corinthians, that the head of the woman is the man, the head of man is Christ, and the head of Christ is God, etc. So even in his full glory, when he's given his glory that he had before the world began, he's still below the Father. So it just shows like a hierarchy in the Godhead.